So wrap us up here. Tell me, in general, what do you think? What do you think the contemporary images of death, dying, murder say about our society?
Well, I think it says in many ways that we're still obsessed with it, and maybe obsessed with it in a way that's not entirely healthy, because in so many ways we deny its existence, even though it drives our every moment of existence. Serial killers aren't just idiots. About zombies earlier. I think
vampires.
Zombies and vampires. They each capture a part of our post-millennial angst in different ways, our post-9/11 angst in different ways. The serial killer seems to have changed his or her, usually his face after 9/11. Zombies have become much more prevalent in our culture after 9/11. There's just something about the fear of our interconnected lives and the fact we're so dependent on each other in technology that it can all be blown apart at any minute. And I think that's why there's such an apocalyptic feeling about some of this, especially with the zombie narratives. But to a lesser extent, vampire and serial killer narratives too. The zombie narrative is just the sheer ugliness of mortifying flesh, somehow given reanimated life, and out to kill us. It's very much an image of corruption and disease. So I think that's a big part of what's going on.
And it does parallel what's happening in our world, doesn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, it's a very hyper-stylized, if you will, representation of our fear of pandemics and how this is all just such a fragile apple cart that we're riding in. Just any one thing could turn it over, and next thing you know, we don't have our computers, we don't have our smartphones.
Right.
All we do have is our ability to rely on our own strength and how many people are really ready for a life-threatening situation.
Right.
If society collapsed tomorrow, how many of us would really survive it?
Right.
And so I think our narratives are fascinated by this and endlessly replay it.
It just brings up more questions than it answers, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
Is there anything else you'd like to add to the interview?
No, I think that we've covered a lot of ground here, as of course we often did back in the day in our philosophy class. And I think it's a fascinating area, and there's much more work to be done in it. The work will never end in many ways because the monsters are always with us. As I said, they differ from era to era. But there's something about serial killers that is, I think, here to stay. We've seen them in the culture for several decades now, sometimes under different names, because the term serial killer itself was a relatively recent coinage. But, I think about Alfred Hitchcock and Psycho in 1960 with Norman Bates, the boy next door, who also happens to be a serial killer.
And a psychopath.
And a psychopath, who also thinks that he's his own dead mother. And yet we're drawn to sympathize with Norman Bates because he is the boy next door. And initially we don't realize, we do now, most of us know who Norman Bates is now, but when you first saw Psycho, you just thought he was covering up for the evil deeds of his mother.
Sure.
And so we were drawn into sympathizing with him, and then given a sucker punch at the end of the film that this guy was not what he seemed, and that is the psychopath, that's the serial killer. And so we've seen versions of him ever since, and I think we're going to continue to do so. I don't think it's any coincidence that after the success of a show like Dexter, now we've got a television show, The Bates Motel. Norman Bates is back with us. Hannibal Lecter, which to many had sort of been consigned to genre history even just a few years ago.
We have the new Kevin Bacon show on Fox also that deals with serial killer, right?
So I don't think I think for a while people were tempted to say the serial killer, especially in the wake of 9/11, had sort of had his day in cultural representations, and I think it was just a cooling off period, if you will. Just like serial murder itself, by definition, involves a cooling off period between murders. And so we're really seeing a resurgence, if you will, in these narratives. And I think it speaks to us in some pretty palpable and disconcerting ways about the mechanical nature of our existence, the fear of violence, the fear of strangers, the fear that someone is out to get us. And there's nothing particularly new about that, but what is...
those sociologically, those are the nuances of contemporary society, right? You never really know the other person. The other person could be out to do you harm. You haven't that emotional connection with other people, and so it makes it attractive
Yeah, and I
that
think
these kind of people would exist.
to me, that's one of the fascinating aspects of the show Dexter. I did want to mention Dexter before we before we moved on here. Dexter, over 8 seasons now, has taken on a very formidable challenge of making a serial killer not only the protagonist, but someone you actually like. And it does so in a couple of very obvious ways. Americans have never particularly had any trouble relating to vigilante killers. It's almost in our cultural DNA in some ways. Vigilante heroes go back a long, long way in our culture. Mm-hmm. But even more so than that, Dexter is presented not just as a vigilante, but a psychopathic vigilante, who nevertheless has adopted intellectually a code by which he can kill people and get away with it, but still satisfy his bloodlust and do society a favor at the same time. But the show's creators didn't take the easy path to just make him an uncomplicated character. They make him a very human, a very identifiable character who has the same problems the rest of us do. He's got to balance his work and his personal life. He's got to be a husband and then later a widower. He's got to be a single father. He has all the family stresses and struggles that any of us do. But he's also got this second job, if you will, that he's got to keep secret from everybody. And it's just been fascinating to watch his development. He's undoubtedly, the most sympathetic serial killer character in contemporary culture. Mm-hmm. And the show is now winding up its run. It'll be interesting to see exactly what his fate is, or if his fate is left open-ended. It's going to be hard to say. But his development as a psychopath without feeling, you realize the show complicates that. Okay, is he indeed a psychopath, or was he presumed to be a psychopath by his father, and then his father completed the process of turning him into a monster? Or did his father help society in some strange way by creating this vigilante? I mean, the show's always going back and forth between those two extremes. Mm-hmm. And Dexter is, I think, key in understanding how serial killers have gotten to this point in our contemporary culture where
they'll continue to evolve, certainly.
They can conceivably even be a hero.
Right.
And to me, well, that's very troubling to some, and I think we've talked about that. But I see exactly how the writers of the show and the writer of the books that the show is based on, I can see exactly how they've structured in such a way that we sympathize with them. Mm-hmm. And again, that's the power of fiction. We're able to get ourselves into the minds of all kinds of characters, just like an FBI profiler getting into the mind of a serial killer.
Right. So. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Okay, I enjoyed it. Thank you.